Welcome everybody to High Street Conversations. We are talking de-anchoring for the final time. So this is de-anchoring part 3. And today we are discussing fragmented ownership. So what has brought this conversation on this week? So as I've discussed in the recent meeting of High Street Conversation, a meeting of ATCM Wales, which took place yesterday, there's been new research which has come out on behalf of the local data company and PricewaterhouseCoopers that suggests that 10,000 stores from multiple retailers disappeared on the high street last year during 2020. The worst annual decline in over a decade, which is pretty significant and pretty scary. Now, obviously, literally in the last day, we have heard that John Lewis is closing further stores. We expected this. I think they made the announcement that further stores were going to be closing about a week or two ago, but the location of those stores has now been announced. And this is hot on the news, obviously, of the closures of Debenhams and Arcadia Group, which means it's been a pretty difficult start for the retail sector for 2021 and the commercial destinations, which is home to retailers. And the real challenge in terms of these particular closures is that a lot of these stores are actually anchor stores. And that changes the dynamics. We're not just talking about, in terms of transformation, it being a simple process of re-letting certain properties. That's not how it works with an anchor store. For a start, some of these anchor stores have actually shaped the wider town centre ecosystem around them, like we've discussed in previous weeks. And also some of these stores have been built to a specification based on that particular retailer's needs, such as their influence. And so sometimes you are talking about a reconfiguration of the property. Sometimes you're talking about a pretty big transformation to get past the loss of an anchor store. Now, I think what we're seeing in terms of the retail sector is not necessarily something which is a short-term problem caused by the pandemic. I don't know if you guys have heard it, but I've heard it constantly as people saying that COVID has accelerated some of the challenge that have been there, that have been ingrained into the retail sector, but it's not necessarily the cause. And actually, when you take a closer look at the stats that have come out from PricewaterhouseCoopers and the local data company, you can see where this comes from. In fact, you might even go as far as to say that COVID hasn't accelerated anything at all when you look at the longer trend for those multiple retailers. In 2015, we lost 1,147 stores. 2016, it was 2,600. 2017, it was 4,000. 2018, it was 6,500. And 2019, it was 7,600. And so there's a clear trend there, an increase year on year. And the most important thing is when you look at this this bar graph at the bottom in orange, and you look at the clear trend with that acceleration of decline year on year, actually 2020 does not look out of place at all with what you would expect based on the figures which have been happening in 2015. So there is clearly a structural problem for retail, and this is not necessarily about the pandemic. And this is where I start to consider if we actually have two challenges when we discuss this particular issue. The first challenge is, and this is something which has always been ingrained in town centres, is that rapid economic change, epitomised at the moment by the loss of retail. And the second challenge is how town centres then adapt to that change. Because one of the challenges I think that sits in the background that makes it difficult to be able to embrace that change is sometimes that lack of a clear ownership framework, which can make things problematic. In ATCM's time, since its foundation, ATCM was formed to help support the growth of management structures within urban centres. We've seen massive growth of private sector-led management schemes, not least in terms of the bid sector, with bids now probably being at the apex of those private sector-led partnerships in town centres, but also the growth in public sector-led management schemes as well. Town centre managers and economic development officers really getting to grips with how they support their town centres. It's probably best epitomised by the work of Stockton Council, who last week were able to present at High Street Conversations to discuss some of the groundbreaking work they're doing around their urban park and riverside development, something which I'm not convinced they would be able to bring forward if Stockton Council itself wasn't heavily invested as a property owner in its town centre. Would this development be would it be able to come forward in the same way if Stockton Council had to deal with a large number of different property owners, or is it something that Stockton's able to do because it is the main property owner of a lot of the property that needs to change within the town centre to allow this to go ahead? That is the issue at hand here. Property ownership is critical, whichever way you look at it. And is fragmented property ownership actually a barrier to the positive change we need to allow our town centres to evolve? Now, the issue of fragmented property ownership has probably cast a shadow over town centres for years, for a very long time. And it's really only in recent years we're starting to understand more about the challenge it's been. Cast your minds back to the report from the New Economics Foundation about Clone Town Britain, which looked at the saturation of retail, looked at the duplication of all the same retail brands in every town, in every city across the land on the high street. And that is probably, is it fair to say that that's born from a place where when you have a fragmented property ownership framework, that each individual property owner quite naturally is looking for the best possible yield they can get. And what tends to happen is so many property owners will gravitate to the same names who they are absolutely sure are able to pay their rent and their rates on time and make life as easy as possible for that individual property owner. But then what you get is the same names everywhere. And then has that caused this lack of resilience when things do have to change because we have that surplus of retail in too many areas? Then consider when the fallout of retail starts, do we then get a proliferation of a lot of the same other businesses that then come in to take the place of that retail? Remember all the discussions around charity shops and bookmakers on high streets. You know, in terms of betting shops, there was this story from The Guardian where this particular guy, Peter Lorimer, on his walk to the post office would have to pass 5 betting shops. The walk was only about 300 yards long. And so the question is, does that proliferation happen because of fragmented property ownership? And is that really the way we want to encourage our town centres to change, with a sort of disjointed strategy? So how do we enable quick and positive change if fragmented ownership is a challenge? And certainly ensuring that that change is quick is important because of the situation we find ourselves in. We discussed in part 1 of the anchoring the challenges for the commercial property sector, the challenges for the Treasury in the UK, for example, because they know there is probably tax in terms of business rates that probably isn't going to come back without reform. When we think about how we get around some of these challenges and how we do it properly, and how we think about deregulation being able to speed up change, you know, one solution the government in the UK has come up with for England is the proposal that permitted development will allow commercial landlords to convert shops, offices, restaurants, post offices, cafes, gyms, nurseries, and a lot of other commercial uses to residential without planning permission. And it's understandable because that allows property owners to adapt and to flex as the situation requires. But ultimately, can that really provide the types of towns we want if there is no central vision, if there is no coordination, either between property owners or with property owners from different stakeholders, such as public sector, community, businesses, etc.? So there's lots of questions here. How do we protect low yield uses that are essential to a local community when we look to speed up the level of change? How do we protect low cost commercial space to bring through the new generation of businesses? How do we ensure the community can play an active role in placemaking if we have fragmented property ownership? So welcome to the Anchoring Part 3, a discussion around fragmented ownership. I am going to stop there and I'm going to bring in our first speaker, who is Alice Fung. Alice, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Just going to pull up
the
presentation.
Introduce yourself, your organisation, and then crack on with your.
Great. Well, thank you for inviting me, OJ, and I'm looking forward to kind of having a good discussion on this, a very topical one. So my name is Alice Fung. I'm from an architecture practice called Architecture 00. I'm based in London. Apologies, very London-centric content coming up. I'm also a mayor's design advocate, and I sit on the workspace advisory group that provides advice to the mayor on affordable workspace. Yeah, I mean, OJ kind of like put the gauntlet down to kind of talk briefly about sort of two pieces of work that we have done over the past couple of years, and also what our kind of like vision in a way for sort of town centres and high streets are. So I'll try and do that. So a piece of work that we produced called Places That Work a couple of years ago came out of just, you know, the what we were seeing as architects involved in regeneration and predominantly workspace and affordable workspace, was the kind of loss of industrial space, and also an increasing kind of not quite fit for purpose sort of generation of employment spaces in our high streets and town centres, mostly in a way as a result of the drive for housing, but also what we're seeing is a loss of a lot of the kind of what we call B1C kind of stock, old kind of the old Victorian warehouses and so on, where other kinds of work would happen, flexible work would happen other than people at computers. And so the report was really looking at, whilst there are a lot of design studies around sort of what productive workspaces could, you know, need to be, there wasn't necessarily a look at kind of what infrastructure might be needed to sort of bring those about. And what we posed was the idea of a new London mix, which was really this breaking down some of the myths of what light industrial and productive workspaces is, that isn't just stuff at laptops, and how those spaces were needed in our high streets and town centres, and how they can work with homes. So in reference to kind of the Neff Clone Town thing, yeah, it's not that underneath each block of flats you don't have to just have a prep, there are other choices. And we see the kind of the benefits of this approach. Well, you know, in a way you could say sort of there's the very kind of traditional approach, which is this oversaturation of F&B in ground floor spaces, but then there isn't the active curation. And what we see is that actually trying to support local local SMEs can have the benefit of diversifying our high streets, but also adding value to those residential blocks in supporting kind of more diverse employment, growth of businesses, and also acknowledging that there are an increasing number of these kind of hybrid businesses where you want to kind of co-locate a little bit of kind of like making perhaps, you know, very small batch manufacturing alongside sort of design and customer facing kind of activities. So it could be sort of you know, social enterprises to last mile distribution, that there is a role for these ground floor spaces within residential blocks to contribute to sort of the ambitions of business rates growth, but also as I say, kind of local skills and employment. Oops, sorry, I've gone the wrong way. And in this report, we looked at sort of scenarios. Well, what would happen in terms of kind of infill behind kind of high streets, and using kind of some of those spaces for kind of rise and for those light industrial kind of like activities. And I'll kind of skip through that. We looked at kind of 5 key recommendations there, and again, I think the main aim is not looking just at kind of the spatial need, although that's clear. To bring about those spatial sort of typologies, we would need things like, you know, a commercial space investment fund, something that is looking at prototyping these forms of development, which, to be frank, are in the UK, developers are very skittish around anything that is a mix. They like residential or they like commercial, but they don't really like a mix. And a second recommendation was perhaps an economic growth company, something that could both hold and manage that kind of series of commercial spaces, even if not to kind of operate all of them. And that's kind of really, I guess, the main part for today, is the kind of this coordination of assets, where you can act more as a portfolio holder, as opposed to this kind of idea of fragmented and trying to deliver projects which individually can create kind of the impact that might be needed in our high streets. And then there are other things like 5 kind of key projects, kind of trailblazing projects to kind of demonstrate the kind of potential sort of education and the kind of policy frameworks that would be needed. Sorry, I keep doing that. And then more recently, our working with the LEAP, and that's London's kind of like LEAP, on a pamphlet to provide some practical kind of guidance on how we might bring forward flexible workspaces on our high streets. And this is really kind of summarising, okay, well, currently we see all these shifts going on. There's kind of growth of e-commerce, everyone acknowledges that there is kind of issue with fragmented ownership, there's increasing retail vacancy, all these things that I think we all kind of in this group know. And our vision kind of moving forwards is really one that's focused on kind of curation and partnership, and how we bring different stakeholders of high streets together, so that there is not just necessarily what might be seen as the kind of the charitable kind of good from the eyes of a kind of more commercially minded stakeholders, where there could be mutual benefit and something that's kind of shared, and that would ideally create for that group of kind of beneficiaries, the idea about sort of sustainable kind of tenants, a stronger local economy, and diversified high streets, all of which would add to kind of asset holders as well as public sector actors. So we explored 4 scenarios. I'll try and kind of whiz through these, but for example, reuse. There are various local authorities who, because the last round of 60, 70 civic kind of buildings reaching end of life, and redeveloping kind of new civic centres, and how they could use some of those kind of kind of underutilized or kind of ex-council officers, for example, in this scenario, to provide a base for local and micro SMEs to kind of jumpstart that kind of SME kind of growth, particularly, I guess, well, pre-pandemic, but also particularly kind of post-pandemic recovery. How might we repurpose empty units within shopping centres? So here looking at how small kind of food kiosks might support sort of the kitchen table entrepreneurs, especially. I think the thinking there was reuse of existing infrastructure, but also that a single occupier would be able to kind of benefit, be able to mitigate the costs of kind of business rates initially, but also create more local kind of identity. So on your chain of sort of F&B, could it be something that's kind of more local? And then similarly looking at the large sort of department store vacancies, and whether that could be used to support certain industries which don't need daylight. So for example, kind of creative digital industries like recording, kind of photography, certain types of sort of like making as well, and indeed in some probably quite niche scenarios, but even the provision of light touch lab space, for example. This is very London focused, so I should stress that comment was more around sort of like London. And then one which we had a very good conversation with OJ on, which is kind of the high street trust and the idea of, well, okay, yes, how might you create a series of different activities ranging from community focused service delivery, health, for example, being one, through to sort of more hyper local kind of responses to needs, whether it's local business space with anticipated changes in the way that we're working, and that there's a share in the up and down of what faces kind of a high street. So rather than each individual landlord trying to pick winners and therefore everyone trying to perhaps get a Pret or a Sainsbury's local, how might they kind of share the kind of the risk, and where some units might focus perhaps more on sort of community, and others then other units could focus more the commercial aspect, but working as kind of a portfolio to share in the financial kind of upside. I'll skip through to this slide, which really this is probably something that clearly an issue is fragmentation of the high street, and especially a lot of absentee landlords and those very unwilling to take risk. And what we're looking at is just trying to kind of understand the pros and cons of these different types of stakeholders, from your very large estate owner, so whether that's a Crown estate type, for example, all the way down to those high streets which that don't have a bid, don't have any governance body kind of in place, and therefore aren't able to coordinate anything at all. Looking at kind of this high streets of trust, whether we're trying to kind of like I suppose kind of create a kind of call to action around how stakeholders could develop more mission-led vehicles to enable them to co-invest without necessarily relinquishing their assets. So it's not necessarily about the council going out and buying up as much assets as it can. Whilst that would be great, that's probably not a reality, and acknowledging that there's different inputs from different types of stakeholders and different levels of risks that each of those stakeholders can take. So is there a mission-led vehicle that doesn't preclude the commercial aspects, but also can benefit from sort of the more sort of grant investment type of activity and curation that perhaps third sector organisations or public sector organisations can sort of take a lead on. Sorry, I've probably gone over my time, but yeah, it's just summarising kind of the recommendations. The ones I think that maybe of particular interest are, a recommendation to create practical templates for these new contractual agreements. So fine, we can all talk about that, would be a nice idea, but given the GLA announced High Streets Mission for All, and there's some associated funding, I guess personally something that I would really like to see, which is maybe not something you hear typically from an architect, is a template contract that would enable people to, even if it's at an MOU kind of level or something, which allows people to start to explore what it is to kind of pool their assets in some way. I think that's is where I'll leave it.
Alice, that's brilliant. I think that's a great introduction to the conversation today. You mentioned the word, which I think is pretty critical actually in this context, risk. Do you think that fragmented ownership really drives down the willingness of people to take risks when it comes to the management of commercial property?
Yes, I mean, I think from our experience, management of property, there's obviously different ways of managing property and to what end. So in terms of the sort of thing we're talking about, which is perhaps out of the comfort zone of most people, and that's local authorities as well as sort of more commercial landlords, the idea of curating the high street kind of you know, people think it should be done, but they don't think they're the ones to do it, to put it frankly. Even local authorities, when it comes to the more sort of enterprise kind of focus, they acknowledge that they are not well placed to act entrepreneurially, you know, and I think it's good that they acknowledge that, but it kind of leaves the gap. And we've seen a rise, certainly in London, of affordable workspace operators who try and bridge that gap where they're sort of mission focused in some way, whether it's on a sector or whether it's on kind of outcomes, but at the same time they're not handcuffed in the same way that a local authority is, but they're such a small part of what's kind of could be happening, you know, in terms of sort of the scale of opportunity. So I would say the ability to kind of take risk is definitely significant.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. I think that's really important. I think something Kelsha mentioned as well, which I think is quite interesting, and we actually got a flavour of this in part 1 of this particular series on de-anchoring, and this came from Ireland, actually, an assessment on Dublin's property market, where there was this recognition that actually, even though some traditional retail space, which is sort of consumer facing, is being lost, some of it was being replaced by what you might call light industrial, a lot of it around logistics, because that thing around online shopping, around last mile delivery was so big. And especially in Ireland, it's not just around changes to do with COVID, but also to do with Brexit, that whole logistics piece was big. And that was something which was actually driving up property ownership. But you see a similar thing in the UK as well, around that sort of last mile and the logistics side of retail.
I mean, yeah, I mean, certainly there's a very low vacancy rates and very kind of increasing levels of rent when it comes to industrial space, whether it's SIL or as in strategic industrial locations, or it's dedicated to that sort of activity, or sort of other industrial estates. I think in terms of sort of, you know, sort of high streets being taken up, units being taken up for sort of last mile sort of distribution and so on, I think that becomes a little trickier, generally because I think that in London at least, landlords are, from what I kind of gather, they still not necessarily looking to kind of move outside of their kind of comfort zone of what they're used to. And I think whilst there is an increase in the kind of industrial rent, that expectations, it's nowhere near what the kind of other commercial rent expectation currently is. So there's still this gap, and whether reality meeting kind of expectations, still not closed by any means, I would say.
That's really illuminating. For everybody on the call, same as normal, questions, comments, feel free to put them in the chat box, and then we can always raise them at the appropriate time with the speakers. So please do send in those comments and questions. Alice, that was really useful. That was really illuminating. Thank you for that. I think we will be watching with interest your work, because the pamphlet, it really looks like a good piece of work, and also the Places at Work document. I recommend it to everybody on this call as well. So it's on Basecamp. We'll make sure we reshare it so everybody's got access to that. It really is fascinating work on the potential future of how we use commercial property in town centres. So thank you for that.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Rebecca, can I bring you in for a quick conversation on community? I think one of the challenges we've got is that because high street governance is a little bit of a mess, that tends to become really problematic for the community in terms of getting buy-in from buy-in in terms of what the vision for their town centre looks like. So it'd be good to hear your perspective. So if you want to introduce yourself, introduce your organisation and the work that you're doing.
Sure, thanks OJ. How long have I got? Oh, you're on mute. A few minutes?
Sorry, cardinal sin. Yeah, 5-10 minutes, however long you need.
Sure thing. All right, I'm Rebecca, also known as Bex. I'm one of the co-founders of a community enterprise called Library of Things, and we basically make it easy for people to save money and reduce waste by affordably renting out useful things like drills and sound systems and sewing machines, and we do that from local spaces. So we install kind of kiosks of things to borrow by the day into high street spaces like community hubs, mixed use venues, cafes, cinemas, libraries. And I've been a community entrepreneur for about 8 years now, mainly in South London, but working in kind of peers of entrepreneurs in lots of different places. I was also working on the startup team for Impact Hub Brixton, which I was also with Alice, who we've just heard from. And so had lots of experience of this kind of appetite and energy that I feel for kind of community-led enterprises of all kinds, right? And that kind of the localized movements that there are around kind of community maker spaces and kitchens and cinemas and affordable childcare play spaces and growing and and well-being hubs, all kinds of, there's lots of my peers have been trying to develop all sorts of exciting new models, and the main barrier they all seem to be coming up against is lack of access to affordable, secure, long-term space to be able to create this this magic which can bring our town centres to life and also support with kind of the loneliness and ecological crises as well. And so that's been my experience, and I guess it's all of the issues OJ and Alice have just flagged are felt for people like me, and it's a combination of actually how do we find out in the first place who even owns all of these properties? Like that's the feeling of the fragmentation. It's like, God, you're just cold calling random numbers, and like that building's been empty for 5 years, but who on earth owns it? And that's been echoed by many of my peers, and then the kind of complete unaffordability and the rent and rates, but largely rents are just way beyond what you can afford as a startup community-led enterprise, and they're largely too high for the even more established kind of community enterprises that can add real social value. And because there's that highest bidder wins approach, let's pick the Pret, there's not that kind of portfolio. Okay, well, this is low yield rent but high yield community and social value. There's not that holistic view. So that's been my experience with the fragmentation issue. And I guess there's been alternatives like trying to work with local authorities, but often the spaces are underinvested. Sort of, here's this leaky garage, we still want 20 grand a year rent on it. And that is starting to change, and there's some really exciting examples of where that isn't the case. But it's still, even now in our negotiations with councils and with shopping centres, there's that rent expectation that's just way above what is possible for us to like come in and reinvent this place. And what the magic that could happen if those rents were just brought right down, even for and suppressed for a couple of years, the magic that could happen on the back of that would be really exciting. So after that experience, I guess I've recently been working on bringing different stakeholders together to shine a spotlight on some of the solutions. Where is this working? And Alice was talking about some of those potential solutions there. But what I've been doing on the back of a kind of a Bill Grimsey review on high streets that I co-authored last year, I'm now convening a group of partners. British Property Federation is one. I can see Jon on the call. Power to Change is another. They fund community businesses and local movements. New Local is another, who work with innovative local authorities to support them to work well with communities. And then High Streets Task Force is another. And we're coming together as a group of partners to run a program for about 15 leaders from property owners, local authorities, and community enterprises to spotlight what is working, where is their movement, and how can we help that stuff to scale. Because we all know what the problems are. Like, let's scale what is working. So that's everything from in Coventry, the local authority has transferred 30 assets into a local heritage trust that it has kind of local governance and accountability and can take that holistic approach. In Plymouth, there's some exciting work around private sector sales, sub-market value sales to a kind of local trust with tax benefits for the owners. There's some bigger property owners that are doing really exciting work to reinvent the community governance model, like Theo from Bywater Properties, who in Belfast has recruited a local group of local business owners and local civic leaders to decide to curate a set of ground floor units in his development, instead of him sitting in London deciding which businesses should operate these Belfast spaces. He's like, you guys do it. You set the rents, you're the curators now. And so there's some of these bigger property owners that are starting to take this a really kind of enlightened approach to kind of community leadership as well. And so we're going to hopefully be kicking off this program in the next couple of months, and we'll be putting out a call for participants, people to join, help us to collate and curate this menu of different innovations in property and in ways it's supporting communities to thrive in town centres. If you want to hear more about it, stick your email in the chat box. I'll send you some more information when it's live.
Rebecca, that's brilliant. That's really useful. I've actually got a comment from Jeremy Rucker. Jeremy, do you want to come in on your comment regarding business rates and community uses?
Here we go. Yeah. Hi, Bex. Thanks for that. That was really interesting. And also, after Alice's presentation, gives us the balance which we need. I've been working with quite a few councils who have suggested to me that they have the ability to negate business rates down to 0 for community projects. Trying to get definition of community projects has met with a sort of brick wall at the moment, but it was more whether anybody else has come across that there is a level of flexibility around business rates. I know it's not relevant exactly now, but it will soon be relevant, and I think will give us the ability to hopefully do more of these types of projects.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody else wants to come in on that as well for clarity. I don't know if that's something which is around discretionary rates relief, which it sounds like, because you need that definition of community, which I guess is assessed locally. I
think I'm aware that in London, but I guess it's applicable everywhere, that local authorities have developed affordable workspace operator lists, so that when a space kind of comes forward, they purposefully are kind of choosing from that list. And one of the considerations is that the people on the list have either an arm or are established governance-wise in a way that means that they have, the workspace they provide is part of the charitable aims, and therefore are should be eligible for the 80% statutory rate relief. But the 20% obviously, as OJ say, being kind of discretionary and coming out of council's kind of own budget, really. That's how I understand it to work. Yeah. So CICs don't by default have charitable status, and I think there's increasingly pressure on social enterprises and so on that aren't charities registered with the Charities Commission. But then I know some CICs who set up a charitable arm to be able to benefit from that statutory rate relief. So it might be that. Yeah, that's interesting. And just to say as well, because we've got members across the UK and Ireland, that this is for England, and there will be variations of the same thing in other nations as well. So thanks for that. Yeah, Rebecca, that was really useful, really useful. And I think it's really good to get that perspective from a community business that wants in and wants to be able to shape a town centre in a way it thinks is beneficial to everyone going forward. I think that's really important, because to be honest, we've probably not had enough of that over the previous decades, which is partly why we are where we are. So thank you very much for that. And we'll definitely be keeping tabs on your work, and we'll probably bring you back into High Street conversations at some point.
Brilliant. So, Eon, are you there? I want to now get a perspective from the British Property Federation around a solution which, for me, has a lot of potential on taking things forward and making a massive change. So, do you want to come in and explain more?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, OJ. And for those of you who don't know me, Jon Fletcher from the British Property Federation. We represent investors in UK property, ranging from individual and family businesses who own a few properties up to the largest institutional investors, the LNGs, the British Lands of this world. So really, really broad spectrum of property owners and their advisors. In a second, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Lawrence, who's really done all of the thinking about town centre investment zones and is far better placed than I am to comment. But I guess what I'd say at this stage is that it's an idea. We think it's a good one. We've taken it to Treasury, we've taken it to MHCLG, we've had some warm words back from them and encouragement to work it up further. But there is a lot of detail still to think about, and a number of you will be a lot better placed than we are to comment on how these things might work in practice, just because you're a lot closer to what's going on in the ground and in town centres and high streets than Lawrence and I are. So really keen to understand what you guys make of the proposal and how we can improve it. So with that, Lawrence, over to you, please.
Sure, I'll just try and share my screen if possible. Let's have a look. Oh, I'm having some security issues. Sorry.
Sharing the screen is always the bit where I come undone.
It never goes well, does it? Okay. Cool. Should be fine. There we go. Can we all see that?
Yep, that's coming up.
Lovely. Okay, so yeah, as Jon said, we have been thinking a lot about town centre investment zones recently. Though it's a lot of recent thinking that's gone into this, we did actually publish a report under the same name back in 2016. Primarily looking at ownership structures within town centres, but traction for that was sort of lost as Brexit and COVID meant changing priorities. But in the last few months, we have been able to give the idea another go, and have been pitching it to government as a way to accelerate its response to accelerating high street pressures. Again, as Jon said, this is a pretty embryonic idea in terms of our thinking about it. So I'd really value hearing, constructive criticism and thoughts on certainly the practicalities of it. So without further ado, let's get on. So before we talk about the solutions, it's perhaps best to pick up on some of the issues that we're trying to solve. I know you touched on that already a little bit, OJ, but basically, our high streets under a lot of pressure because of structural change to consumer behaviour, which is moving retail online at a very fast pace. That will likely be accelerated by the crisis, and we'll probably see that in full once the cliff edges and the government support schemes all expire. But it is happening already with closures up and down the country. As you can see on the slide, retail spending is unsurprisingly up significantly for 2020, up to 35.2%. Well, that's online retail spending, but that's no new thing. It's been increasing every year, and records have been set all the way back to 2010 and beyond. So at the same time as retail is moving online, we also have customers changing their high street preferences and what they want from their high streets. So leisure and residential use are on the way in, large anchors on the way out. I found a good stat from EG Radius, which said that retail square foot take up is 66% down since 2017. added to this, a lot of property owner investment is going to be needed in order to repurpose and change high streets. But in many parts of the country, especially where the changes are needed, the land values just don't make that attractive. And also high streets, perhaps partly because of that fragmented ownership issue, don't have a large scale vehicle through which investors can pledge their capital. There is also very much that issue of fragmented ownership with different owners pulling in different directions and not allowing a cohesive plan for a town centre to take shape. So, looking at those issues, the solutions have to match them. We think that a solution needs to be able to provide rapid and flexible change, especially in light of the high street, in light of the effect the crisis is having on the high street. It needs to make investment viable where it's currently not, and it needs to incentivize partnership and overcome that fragmented ownership problem. So income town centre investment zones. Basically think enterprise zones, but with far more reaching powers and a prior condition applied that means an effective partnership between local stakeholders has to be in place before the incentives or powers that you get from a town centre investment zone are available. The idea there is that the prospect of these new powers or incentives should incentivize that partnership working in the first place, which is probably the most powerful driver for high street change. So, sorry for the very big slide. So what policy tools do we think that could include? Well, we think that high streets need more than business rates exemptions and capital allowances as in enterprise zones. We do think there needs to be some tax incentives. So business rates relief and retention is a good idea, as well as perhaps new tax raising powers, and also enhanced planning resource. So say a pool of funding, especially for the town centre investment zone planning area, so that the local authority has the skills and capacity it needs in order to drive through that change. Added to that, you could also layer on top an enhanced leasing environment. So that could include automatic contracting out of the 1954 Act, security of tenure, which provides a lot of uncertainty for all parties. You could have a new clear license to occupy. There's a lot of reluctance around licenses at the moment because they can quite easily become leases. So making sure that process is clearer would be helpful. You could also have things like a rental payment contingency plan as outlined there, where struggling tenants are given a guarantee of forbearance in exchange for property owners being able to get a surety of income, perhaps provided in part by the local authority or national government. Added to that, you could have vibrancy and environment measures there. So tax efficient grants for building improvements within the zone, maybe exemptions from Sunday trading restrictions, perhaps, to be decided, I suppose, in terms of the full suite of policy tools that would become available. So finally, so what does the partnership that should be in place before you can have access to all these tools, what should it look like? Well, to be honest, this is probably the bit we've done the least thinking on. But in our 2016 report, we suggested a town centre investment management vehicle where all local landlords pool their resources. Perhaps that could be overly arduous and not suitable everywhere. So it might be that the requirement is just a bit more flexible than that. We think it probably would at least need to encompass these 3 points though. So first of all, some form of pooling, even if that is just a plan amongst owners to work in a more coordinated way. You need local buy-in and you need that overarching plan with the local authority and with all stakeholders knowing where they want to take their town centre. Yeah. Any questions?
Tons of questions. Wow, tons of questions. Right, I'm going to open it up to the floor, I think. So can I ask people if you've got comments or questions, once again, put it in the chat box. So it's a really, really interesting idea. And from my perspective, in conversations with the government, I would say, why wouldn't you want to allow this? So two essential parts. Firstly, on the one hand, you allow things like incentives, tax relief, planning incentives for big change and transformation to be enabled and emboldened. But on the other hand, to allow it to happen, you need a partnership in place. You'll need to have the community on board. You'll need to have key stakeholders, local authorities on board, for example. It needs to be done as a shared approach. So for me, this makes sense. Nicola, do you want to come in with your question?
Yeah, very happy to. So we actually we had a forum of property owners in Putney together, looking at the future High Street Fund application. And round the table, they seemed very keen on the various different ideas. And actually, it's interesting. One of the things that we wanted was to try and set up like an entrepreneurial hub in one of their many vacant units. But actually, when it came down to it, none of them were prepared. And I think it was the risk thing. So I'm just curious to know what the property owners that you represent think about it. Is it that the benefits that you're saying is what moves the risk proportion for them, and therefore they're pro the idea? Because we thought in theory they were all really pro the idea, but when they actually looked down and looked at the figures, they then got put off.
I can have a go at answering that. I mean, I guess there's always going to be differing views among property owners about anything. It's kind of ask two lawyers a question and get three different answers sort of thing. But I think that there is a general recognition that things need to change quite quickly in town centres. And while a lot of property owners would love for rents to stay where they are and not keep dropping, the reality is that that's what's going to happen, and that there is going to need to be a real shift in mindset and in risk, the way that the property industry measures and values risk. These proposals that we've got, I guess, are a way of helping us overcome that transition in a way that ultimately should reduce the risk profile. It won't surprise you that we and Alice have come up with very similar proposals when it comes to pooling, assets and expertise and that sort of thing, because I think that's the way that you get around this risk issue. I don't pretend for one second that it's going to be easy to bring some people on board, but I'm struggling to see another way around it. So sorry, to answer your question, the ones that property owners that we represent are behind it. Whether that means that everybody in the property community would support it, I can't say that for sure.
Thanks for that, Nicola. Thanks for that, Jan. Yeah, it's a really interesting idea, and it's definitely something I think needs to be considered. So what I am suggesting from ATCM's perspective is that this is maybe a conversation we take into a joint meeting of our board and advisory council, and also something which once we start to discuss some of the details, or also support BPF in terms of conversations with our APPG for town centres as well, because I do think this idea does have merit, and there's more to explore with it. If there's any more comments or questions, please let me know now, or else I do want to bring in just one more perspective on the ability of being able to pull resources of property owners, which, as Nicola suggests, is a big part of this. So any more comments and questions just before I move on? No? Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Jan. Thanks a lot, Lawrence. What I'm going to do then is, Paul Barnes, can I introduce you to the group?
Hi everyone.
Hi, and can I get you to talk about something which has been discussed in the past, which I think actually has a great deal of synergy with the conversation around pooling the assets of property owners. So do you want to take it away?
Okay, thank you, Jay. Hello, everyone. Yes, we've heard already this afternoon from Rebecca and Alice and Jon and Lawrence that there are a number of different ways that you can involve the property industry in the future transformation of town city centres. And not everyone is appropriate for every particular situation. And what I'm going to do today is just fill in another piece of the jigsaw, which is the role of the property industry with business improvement districts. Just to give you a little bit of background from me, I've had 30 years as a consultant, helping clients to shape property, to shape government policy at national government and at local government level, predominantly in the property, retail and town centre spheres. So my clients, just to give you an example, have been over the years normally at chairman and chief executive level, organisations like Boots, Sainsbury's, Eon's own British Property Federation, the Crown Estate, the National Trust, what was English Partnerships. So some fairly big organisations who have a whole interest in the future of urban space and beyond. But in particular, over the last 20 years, I've been an advisor to the New West End Company, which is the business improvement district for Oxford Street, Bond Street, Regent Street, London's West End. And also I've been an advisor to Holber, which is the Heart of London Business Alliance, which sits next door to it. It's Leicester Square and Piccadilly Circus. The reason for mentioning those two as important is because they are as yet the only two property bids in the UK. I've been involved right from the very start in formulating the bid legislation right back in the early 1990s with the initial legislation to set up business improvement districts, and then in the early 2000s with the extension to potential for property bids. Now, most recently, I've got together with a number of consultants who are experts in their own fields on town centre transformation to set up a group called Attis Towns, which brings together under one umbrella those sort of core elements that you need for transformation of town centres, such as vision, placemaking, planning, transport, but also some of those other ones that are all part of the mix. So security, like the late night economy, branding, marketing, digital, all of these under one umbrella to deliver, and deliver is the important word, deliver successful town centres. Now, clearly, there's a lot of partners, statutory, commercial and others, who we get involved in on this, but there are two elements that we believe are central to creating sort of vibrant, viable and sustainable town centres. One is you have to have visitors at the heart of everything. That's your core. If you get your visitors in and you get the right visitors in, your town centre is going to work. If you don't and they're not the right ones, it's not going to. That's for another day. But the other key element for us is you need to have property owners at the heart. Property owners need to be real drivers of the change in town centres. Now, clearly, the local authorities have the statutory authorities. There are lots of interest from the various communities and such like. But I just want to focus in on the community, on the property element, because curiously, they're often missed out. If you look just a year or so ago, when one of the House of Commons select committees looked into the future town centres, I added up the witnesses who gave evidence. There were about 35 of them gave evidence, oral evidence. Only 2 of them represented the property industry. One was Ewan's British Property Federation and another was a landlord. Now that to me didn't seem to represent the wide interest of property in town centres. There were lots of retailers, there were lots of local government people, there were lots of academics, but property to us is the key because they have 2 things that are important. Firstly, property owners have the incentive. Occupiers, as we've seen with John Lewis, can walk away. If they don't, if they don't think that town centre is working, they can hand their lease in, they can go. Property owners can't. They are there with a fixed asset that they need to do something with. And secondly, they're the ones who have the resources and are prepared to, where necessary and when persuaded, to put those resources into the town centre transformation. Possibly to match with local government, but no matter, to put the money into those resources, into those investments. And we discovered at New West End Company, when we got the property industry involved in the bid, formally as a property bid, that it brought a whole new perspective to the way in which the bid thought. Because when the bid was an occupier bid, it was very short term in its views. What its focus was on street services, marketing, anything that would show that, you know, in the next quarter, the next half year results would show good results for their particular store, their particular enterprise. When we got the property owners involved more formally, their perspective was much longer term. Now, clearly, in the centre of London, you do have the great estates. The Crown Estate, Grosvenor, have been there for 300 years. Their interest in what happens in a year's time or 2 years' time it's important to them, but they're looking at the next 300 years. They're looking at those longer term investments that get overlooked when bids tend to be predominantly occupiers, but which property owners take on board that longer term view. Now, the issue with property bids, of course, is that they are very restricted geographically in where they can take place. And the reason for this is because when we got the legislation changed, all of those of us working on it, it wasn't a specific piece of legislation on property bids. We piggybacked a clause onto a government bill that was looking at business rate supplements to help finance major infrastructure projects, brackets, Crossrail. So actually it was very much restricted to London because that's where this bill geographically covered. Secondly, because of the niceties of local government finance, you could only have a property bid where there was an existing occupier bid. Now, New West End Company got its bid result on Friday. Fantastic result, 99% yes from the occupiers, 97% yes from the property owners. But if the occupiers had voted no, the property owner bid would not be able to stand because it has to be on an occupier bid. So the current legislation for property bids is actually very limited. It's in London and it's only directly on the footstep of an existing bid. You can't set up one outside London. You can't do one that's not on an existing bid. So there's very clearly, there's scope for change there. And it's something I think we'll be talking, Attis Towns, we'll be talking with the BPF and with OJ and colleagues about looking to extend that legislation so that you can get property bids throughout the whole of the country. However, you don't need actually a formal property bid to get property owners involved. Now, many of you probably already have a voluntary element to it. And indeed, New West End Company, which was set up before business improvement districts were legislated, so there were no such thing. It was actually set up by a group of 5 major property owners in the West End who were very concerned about the state of Oxford Street, and together said, well, can we not all group together and over time buy Oxford Street? So it's too big for us to own on our own, but hey, the Crown Estate owns Regent Street. Couldn't we together buy Oxford Street and then we would have more control over how it develops? It proved to be too difficult, but what they did was they agreed to set up a sort of management body and they agreed to put some money voluntarily into a pot. And then we worked to get the legislation through and up came the occupier bid in order to include the occupiers as well as property owners. And even before we set up the property bid in New West End Company, the property owners still put a lot of money voluntarily into the pot. So the property owners can take a lead, not just in setting up business improvement districts, but actually taking a role in them and putting money into them to put not just the resources, the money into it, and also the resources into change in the town centres, but also contributing that long-term thinking, that strategic thinking, which is sometimes missing from the occupational side of the bid industry. I'm in the process of setting up 2 new bids, one in Knightsbridge, one in on the Brompton Road, one in King's Road. And both of those are led by the property owners, with the exception, of course, of Harrods in Knightsbridge. You'd expect that, but they are property owners there. But all the others are property owners. They see the benefit of a bid and they see the benefit of a vehicle which focuses the minds of businesses in the area and actually has a legitimate position within the local infrastructure of decision makers and influencers as a formal bid. So the property owners are driving these bids, even though they themselves won't actually be part of the bid, because in these two cases, in the Kings Road and Brompton Road, we are allowed to set up a property bid. We can do it. But we actually think, given the range of property owners there, it's really not worth doing it. And instead, you can get them to voluntarily agree to do what they would do for a property bid, which is the way that we've gone down the route. Now, that then leads to something that could be quite useful outside London as a way forward. Because when you think of bids, for those of you who are familiar with them, the occupiers are asked to vote on a business plan, a costed business plan. And if a majority, two majorities vote in favour of that, then all those eligible have to pay in. They pay their business rate levy as part of their, so that they pay their their levy for the bid as part of their business rates. So you do have to go through quite a lot to persuade those occupiers to vote to increase their business rates to provide funding for local services. But actually, in some cases, maybe you don't need that money. Maybe the property owners will put that money in. But what they need is a vehicle, because we've just heard talk about, you know, the issue of legal vehicles that you can use and that are agreeable to everyone. Well, there's a legal vehicle sat on the statute book. It's called a business improvement district. And it's very clear how it's used. So there's the ability, we think at Attis Towns, that you could take the existing business improvement district legislation, you could run an occupier ballot and say, this is everything we're going to do, here's the business plan laying it out, but actually your business rate levy will be £1. That's what it'll be, or a minor fraction of your business rate. So de minimis amount of money. So why wouldn't you vote for it? Why wouldn't you vote for it? By doing that, you've then set up a legislative vehicle which can be used for the purposes of promoting transformation, change, and management in a town centre. What you're missing is the money. But our property owners are saying, well, we'll put the money in. We just need a vehicle to put it in. And the bid has allowed us to create this vehicle. Now, if you do that, we think you could turn a bid ballot round in about 3 months. Because you haven't got a lot of persuasion to do. You know, you're just saying, hey, look, vote for this. It's only going to cost you £1, and look at all this money that will come in. So if the property owners get together and agree that they want to work together as a group in a town centre, then there is already an existing vehicle to do it. It's not been tested, and we're talking to government about whether it is legitimate and talking to our lawyers, but we think it is. And that then suddenly allows you to use the existing bid mechanism to engage and get involved the property industry, which you can do anyway now, but to set up bids in a lot more speedy and in areas where you may not, due to occupiers, think you would otherwise get them. So there's a range of different ways in which you can get the property industry interested and involved in bids. There is absolutely no doubt that it is worth getting property owners involved in bids, as I said, not just because of the resources they bring, but also that strategic vision they bring. And when I say resources, I mean resources to the bid, but also, of course, they have access to capital if necessary to do the sorts of works that you need in terms of transformation. But the other thing, of course, they bring, we talked about the vision, is what Rebecca was talking about earlier, and Alice, was about curation. In the Knightsbridge area, we're looking at how you curate Knightsbridge. What is the vision? What do you want? We know what most visions in town centres are. Those visions are to achieve, you know, viable, vibrant, sustainable town centres. That's the vision for every town and city centre, isn't it? It's just a different way of achieving that vision for each different circumstance. And in Knightsbridge, for example, they've made a very clear distinction. The property owners have got together, they put money behind it to come up with the vision, which we're not going to announce yet, but it's, well, actually, no, it is sort of public. You know, the vision is that Knightsbridge area should be a combination of high-end luxury, global luxury, combined with the right type of quality of amenities for local residents and workers. That's the vision. Now, what's happened by agreeing that vision is that the property owners are now working together to deliver it. They're not going to deliver it all. There'll be stuff there that doesn't fit that vision at all. But they've now got in their mind that this is the vision. This is what they're aiming for. This is how they will try to curate their tenants. This is how they will try to provide what Rebecca and Alice were talking about earlier. Almost places that are almost lost leaders in terms of property that you rent out, in order that it raises the value of the entire area. With the vision, you can do that. And with the involvement of the property owners, you can do that. And with the property bid, you can involve the property owners. So I'm conscious I've gone over my time, but I'm just trying to put that last little bit of the jigsaw that says there are lots of different ways to get there. And maybe the property bid, either just in London or a different version of it outside London, is another way to get there.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks a lot, Paul. I've got so many questions, so many comments. I think what I'm going to do is, first things first, I'm going to hand over to Advisory Council member Chris Wade. Chris, you have a comment regarding something Paul said around absent landlords. Do you want to come in?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm laughing at the thought of it. Go on.
Hi, Paul. Great in terms of you coming up with a workable model using present legislation,
Yeah.
and very often the way is there in these things. It's the will, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's still the issue of that collective asset management, which the town centre investment zone model, as I understand it, takes it a step further. And it's that, how do you balance that, those people that are going to give a low rent to the key attractor or the community facility, that somebody else is gaining from, their subsidy. How do you kind of level that out, particularly when you get away from Knightsbridge, when you've got very fragmented
absolutely.
ownership?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, again, there's two or three things. First of all, right at the beginning, I said there's no one system that's right for everything, and it may well be that these systems aren't right, and the BPF has got a different system which works in different ways. I absolutely 100% accept that. Secondly, you'll never get 100% absolutely right on any project you do. If you look at Shaftesbury, for example, using them again, I know they're at Central London, I apologise, but Shaftesbury, who have effectively become a modern great estate, in that they have focused on buying up property in certain areas in order to create new estates like Carnaby Street and Chinatown and parts of Fitzrovia. If you talk to them, they will say, hey, we don't need 100%. There's a minimum we need to get it, and it's probably around about 75, 80%. And once we have that sort of ownership under our control, we can determine this. Okay, 25% is out of our control, but we've become big enough. Now, that's just one company buying up property within an area. But you can imagine the guys who were looking at Oxford Street were going, well, look, maybe if 5 of us bought Oxford Street, we won't buy all of it, but we'll buy sort of 80%. Then the 5 of us can work together, but we need a vehicle to work together in order to agree between us in a very combination of commercial and gentlemanly way, that some you win, some you lose, and we'll give a bit of rent on this in order to get a better rent there, and actually the entire asset value will rise because of the type of community we're creating. So you do need a very good relationship, and it clearly was between those great estates. So that might be not the best example, but I think my bottom line will be nothing's perfect. You don't need 100%. You don't want to let perfection be the enemy of the good, and it can be done. But in many places it probably can't be done. But hey, let's have a whole armory of things to look at.
Jan, can I bring you in as well? I can see your hands up.
Thanks. Yeah, just to add, Lawrence mentioned what we did in 2016, and we actually looked at three places, not in London. We looked, well, one in London. We looked at Dartford, Melton Mowbray, and Weston-super-Mare, and we looked at what might a town centre investment zone look like, and what kind of conditions would need to be met in those 3 places. And it's interesting that Paul mentioned 75%, because that's exactly what our report found as well. In order to get critical mass to make something like a town centre investment zone, you'd need about 75% of the freeholds in the relevant area. Like the places that we picked, that represents between 40 to 60 property interests. So it's a large but not a huge number. And in terms of, you know, the acquisition and adaptation costs of implementing a kind of town centre investment management approach ranged from 25 to 35 million pounds. So again, a fair slug of money, but not an astronomical sum. And these are kind of, you know, medium-sized town centres. Clearly the numbers will have changed since we ran them in 2016. But I think the other thing that our report from 2016 found is that if you want to get institutional money into these sorts of initiatives, then they're not going to spend £5 million here or there. They want to be able to deploy hundreds of millions of pounds in one go. And so you potentially need some sort of aggregator vehicle that pulls together a range of vehicles that happen in individual locations. So that's potentially bringing in another layer. You know, I'm not saying that institutional investment is necessary in some of these places, but yeah, I'll leave it at that.
That's really interesting. And Emily, can I bring you in to make your comment as well about South Wales?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've got particularly much to say beyond what I've typed, and obviously not specific to South Wales, but obviously, you know, you've spoken very specifically about, you know, some parts of central London where there's a lot of money in property and there's huge amounts of money to be made, which I imagine is helpful in bringing sort of commercial property owners along. If you're looking at locations where there's potentially less money to be made and people are actually trying to sort of shed properties from their portfolio, do you see a solution like this being able to be deployed in those places, or is it just sort of the areas where there's big money to be had?
So in terms of the model, we're talking about property owners voluntarily funding a bid.
Oh, yes, yeah, sorry, I wrote that when Paul was talking about his sort of £1 bid levy situation.
Yeah,
I mean,
Paul, so what do you think? Can it work in a place, for example, like South Mid Wales?
The thing about this is that it's not just you know, a two-dimensional issue. It's got lots of different elements to it. So the first thing is, you know, in certain cases, like you know, some of the first bids we set up with, we're not going there asking for hundreds of millions of pounds to do major capital works. You know, it's taken us 20 years to get 150 million quid to do Oxford Street. That was the aim of the original bid, and it's only just started. But in the 20 years beyond, in between, we've had lots of things we needed to spend on. And actually, when we got the property owners together, say for Knightsbridge, and we got 10 of them round a room and said, here we are, and this is the first steps, and this will set you up a bid, and this will get your vision, and this will do this. And by the way, between the 10 of you, it's probably only going to cost you about 15, 20 grand each over 2 years. They were going, what? That's our tea money sort of thing. And putting them all together into one room and saying, actually, you can split the cost of this joint work between you. It doesn't actually come to much money. That in itself has a big value over and beyond the capital works that will have to be done, you know, to do some of the transformation. It pulled them together. It made them think. It made them invest in the vision. It made them put money into a team that will now look to deliver that over time. So we're not in that case talking about the hundreds of millions, or, you know, tens of millions you might want to do some major transformation work. So that's one where there's different dimensions. How much money do you want and what do you want it for? And the other thing is, you know, those property owners have got properties sitting in these towns and city centres that they can see are declining in value. And if they do nothing, they're going to continue to decline in value, and they'll get to a stage where their value is become almost zero. Whereas if they do some investment, that's the chance to turn it around, because there is a future to town centres. It just won't look what it's like now. And if they're not prepared to do it, their value will fall so low that in will come others and pick up that property quite cheap and will be prepared to do it. So I think, you know, there is an issue of the market working here to some extent, but nobody's going to come in and pick up that asset if the town centre is dying and nobody's doing anything about it. You know, they'll want to come in. I'm going to invest. I'm going to buy this, and I'm going to invest because I can see its future.
I do think that there is an issue of, you know, no one's going to let their property in central London deteriorate and fall to a value where no one wants it, there are in sort of, your deprived areas around, outside of London and in other parts of London, properties that people have basically abandoned to fall to no value because they have got nothing to do with them and don't want anything to do with them. I'm just thinking more about those kind of places.
No, you are right. And again, maybe I'm just being a bit too idealistic here. But one of the reasons that you and I, if we were property investors, would be unlikely to go and invest in properties like you've just described is because there's no future in them. You're going to invest in somewhere where you see a future. And in many cases now with town centres, that future needs planning. It doesn't need just sit there and hope for the best and hope we might get another tenant in and a pret-a-manger might move in when we know they won't. It's about what is the future of this town centre. It may be this town centre has no future. In which case that's a wholly different thing. And, why aren't we turning it all into housing or something? But it may be it has a different future. But without the vision and the planning and the working together of the local authorities and the property owners and the community, that future isn't going to be realised, and therefore the value isn't going to be realised.
I think it's such an interesting conversation. I think just to give a little bit of context to some of the things Paul's speaking about, it would have been about 2 years ago now, ATCM held a all-party parliamentary group meeting for town centres on the issue of property owner bids, where we got a little bit of the background and the detail and the history of how bids came into the UK from Nick Rainsford, who was a local government minister at the time, who introduced the legislation. And he was quite clear that at the time, he had a lot of pressure that bids should be for property owners, and that there was an appetite from the property sector to develop the vehicles that they could use to invest in their areas. That's what property owners wanted. And the reason why it didn't happen was simply because there wasn't the right infrastructure in terms of the tax system already in place that would allow it to happen. Our business rates, yes, business rates is levied upon commercial property, but it's on the occupier, not the property owner. So there just wasn't that ability there to make bids work in that way. But that's the only reason why it didn't come in. Property owners wanted it. There are issues with absentee landlords, but I think there's enough property owners out there who are willing to invest. They're just looking for the vehicle to do that.
And people to get them together. In Knightsbridge, nobody got anyone together. And eventually, one of the big estates there again said, okay, let's do something about this, and used their various contacts and whatever. And we convened that initial meeting. And Joe, I think, Joe Hammond, you were there, weren't you? Or, you'll know it. It was about someone to take control, not necessarily the local authority, although clearly they are the key players here. But one of the problems with local government at the moment is during the time of austerity, there were cuts made through local government services, and all the non-statutory posts disappeared, which included strategic planners, because they were a luxury that local authorities couldn't afford, which is why you need leadership. And I'm not saying local authorities don't take leadership, but they need support to take that leadership in some cases. And the property industry, who has a vested interest in getting it right, are key players in taking that lead.
Okay, I've got some quick questions. Jan, I want to bring you back in. So we've had a lot of discussion about the sort of formal arrangements, a formal way of collectively bringing property owners together, and also looking at voluntary schemes as well. Do you think there will be a massive difference in the quality of outcomes if a town was using that sort of formal mechanism to pull the resources of property owners? A big difference between that and possibly a voluntary solution, such as a landlord forum?
I think that depends on what you get in exchange for bringing everyone together. So our proposal is everybody comes together, and in return for that, they get a series of powers that makes transformation easier and quicker than it otherwise would be. Those powers aren't necessarily fundamental to the change that needs to take place, because what the really important thing is that people get together. So, on one level, whether that happens formally or informally is kind of by the by. It would be nice if government could say, we recognize that getting together is the important thing, and here are some powers, here are some goodies that we'll give you if you all do, because there are at present a number of barriers and obstacles and all sorts of reasons and incentives why that getting together isn't happening, even though everyone in this room would agree that it's a good idea. So I guess it's just trying to lower the threshold for forming a united set of local stakeholders.
That's again really interesting. I think I've written down so many questions here. I'm not even sure. Oh, right, here we go. So and also I think last one before we wrap up, because we are so close to time now. In terms of the idea of a property owner bid, Jon, do you think that is something that could complement a town centre investment zone? Do you think that would be something which will be separate from a town centre investment zone? I mean, for ATCM, we have diversity in terms of the management schemes which are within our membership, and it might be that our approach would be we need both, and it just depends on what suits certain town centres the best. But do you see these two separate models as something that can work together, or do you think they would naturally be separate things?
I don't see any reason why they shouldn't work together. I think we need to make it as easy as possible for places to do what they need to adapt. And the more ways that you can bring people together to do that, the better, I think. I mean, we're huge supporters of property owner bids as well, for all the reasons that Paul's already mentioned. So I don't think they need to be mutually exclusive in any sort of way.
And hey, that would be a lovely problem to have, wouldn't it? We've had property owner bids possibility in London for the last 15 years, and we've only got 2. I don't know how many bids we've got, but only 2 out of 60 or so bids. So it would be a lovely problem to have, that all these property bids springing up and potentially clashing with other options. But let's just get some of them going.
Guys, that's really, really interesting. I think we could talk for another half an hour on this topic. There's so much to do, and I think we will keep this discussion going. Always been really interested in property owner bids and how we take that forward. Jon, I think the town centre investment zone, I think now is the time. Some of those big challenges we've had are out the way. I'd be really keen for ATCM to invest a little bit of time in taking this forward, going through the plans, and seeing what we can do to help you shape them and lobby for them. So thank you very much for that. Just before we wrap up, just to let everybody know, High Street Conversations is not happening next week. Next week, we are bringing together ATCM Northern Ireland. We may come back the week after that. I'm not meant to be having High Street Conversations, but given we are getting closer to reopening non-essential retail in England and Wales, we may have something just to touch base to see how things are going, and then again a week later just to discuss progress on reopening. So I will let everybody know on what happens on that. Otherwise, thank you very much everyone for being involved. It's been a really interesting discussion. Alice, Rebecca, Jon, Lawrence, Paul, thank you for the contributions. They've been really useful. I look forward to speaking to everyone again soon. And what we'll do is, I think there's a number of important issues we brought up here, which we will continue to speak about. So thanks everyone. Cheers.